Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 3. Today we'll be discussing exploring rhetorical situations. Before we begin, there will be a lecture assignment, so you'll need a document to write on and access to the Project 1, the Rhetorical Analysis, assignment description. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. First, we'll define the term rhetorical situation. Then we'll understand rhetoric is contextual and something that's always in flux. And finally, we'll identify and examine specific components of rhetorical situations. All right, so first let's start to put definitions to terms. So, rhetorical situation. Remember during our last lecture, we defined the term rhetoric as the art of persuasion. It is a speaker or a writer's attempt to get an audience to think about their position as correct, or to accept their argument, or take up the action that the speaker wants them to take up. And we explored it through the use of Aristotle's three artistic proofs. Remember, that's logos, pathos, and ethos. And that's a way for us to basically say, okay, well, how is the speaker, how is the writer, how exactly are they persuading their audience? Now, today, by looking at the rhetorical situation, we're going to examine all of the things going on around the speaker and around the audience that shape the speaker or writer's attempt at logos, pathos, and ethos. So basically, by examining the rhetorical situation, we'll say, okay, this is why the speaker decided to go with more anger-based emotions, or why they decided to use these facts and statistics, or why they decided to cite this individual to establish their ethos or their authority. Now, a rhetorical situation, in its most basic sense, is the environment in which a writer or speaker creates rhetorical discourse. Now, the rhetorical situation in its more basic form considers three things, and these three things are foundational. It considers the purpose, the audience, and the constraints. Now, if we think about the concept of a rhetorical context, well, what does that mean for rhetoric? I mean, how does that influence how we understand this term and the ways in which speakers attempt to persuade audiences? First and foremost, it suggests that rhetoric is context-based. So, for example, if you are trying to convince your audience of going to see the new Spider-Man movie, how perhaps you convince your girlfriend and what you say to your girlfriend to get her to go with you might be entirely different than a group of your best friends or your buddies. And that might be incredibly different than how you convince your 7-year-old niece or nephew to go with you as well. And so, because you are trying to convince different audiences, even though your argument is essentially the same, um, you have to adapt and take specific approaches for that audience and for that situation. So of course, appeals will change based on the available means of persuasion. So for example, if you can guarantee, maybe if you're trying to convince your girlfriend to go with you, maybe she really likes movie theater popcorn, and you recognize that that is an available means of persuasion for that specific context and her as your audience. Maybe you emphasize to say, hey, if you come see this with me, we can get one of the collectible popcorn bowls, and it'll be huge and you can eat all of it and it's all yours. Whereas if you go with your buddies, you could perhaps say, hey, we can now, if you come with me, then we can talk about all of the theories of the multiverse and how that applies to the Spider-Man comics. And of course, if you're convincing your 7-year-old niece or nephew, all maybe you really have to say is, let's go see Spider-Man because it's Spider-Man. So there are different means by which you can persuade your audiences based off of the context of the situation. Now, of course, not all rhetorical approaches are considered equal. Think about if you were to shift, one argument that's appropriate for one audience to another. So let's say perhaps an argument that works for your friends, saying, hey, we can talk about all of the theories of the multiverse and how it applies to the Spider-Man comics. If you were to try that on your girlfriend and she had no interest whatsoever, then that would not work for her. And that would not be considered an equal approach in that context, perhaps as saying, hey, I'll get you, a big bucket of popcorn and some candy because you like movie theater food. And maybe saying, hey, 7-year-old niece or nephew, let's talk about the intricate theories of the multiverse and how it applies to the Spider-Man comics. That would probably go way over their head and probably would be ineffective in comparison to just saying, hey, come on, it's Spider-Man. Let's just go see the movie. Now, what this really boils down to is that a speaker or writer must be aware of several factors going on before creating a persuasive message. Now, the first thing that we're going to look at is exigence, or it's also called purpose. So these terms are often interchangeable. Now, this answers the question, why is the writer writing, or why is the speaker speaking? We can unpack that a little further to say, what are they writing in response to? So for example, let's say that, great example. Okay, so the Utah Jazz just increased the prices of their season ticket for their season ticket holders. Now we are seeing a lot of people writing persuasive messages, getting them to lower the costs. They are writing in response to what these season ticket holders see as an egregious increase. So they're writing in response to an unfair price increase on their season tickets. So you want to ask yourself, what is the writer writing in response to? We can also see this in the same way with political messages. So if someone is saying, vote for me, like we saw in the last lecture with MJ Hagar, okay, well, what was she speaking in response to? She was speaking in response to certain policies and practices she didn't agree with, and changes that she thought needed to be made. So that was her exigence. That was why she was speaking. That was what she was responding to. So as you go through and you look at the project one artifacts on there, whichever one you ultimately decide to analyze, you really want to ask yourself and say, okay, what is this in response to? Why are they writing? Why are they making this argument? What prompted them to make this argument for this specific audience? Now, what this does is it speaks to the goals and intentions of the writer. So, of course, not only do you get their argument in there, vote for me, let's go see Spider-Man, it's the best, movie option for us to see right now, regardless of what that is, the exigence will always shed light on what the goal and intention of the writer is, and also, in fact, shapes them quite well. And so, it allows the speaker to really narrow down and refine what their argument is if they can clearly identify and articulate what it's in response to. So, for example, if there were no price increases for the Jazz season ticket holders, and people just started saying, hey, the prices shouldn't be this high, it really wouldn't make sense, and their message really wouldn't be as persuasive if there was no price increase, because the exigence wouldn't be there, the purpose wouldn't be there, because the situation itself wouldn't exist. And so not only does it speak to the goals and intentions of the writer, but it clearly identifies the argument being made and what that argument is being made in response to. The next thing that we'll want to consider is audience. Now, we'll explore audience in greater detail throughout the semester, but this is just an opportunity to become familiar with the term and start to situate it within rhetoric and within persuading members of the public. So audience answers the question, who is the writer trying to persuade? So with audience, what's important to remember, as I see it, you can have an audience and you can have a public. A public are just a collected group of random individuals that happen to be in the same geographical or digital location. And so they can hear a message, right? Of course. But an audience, what makes an audience, especially when we think about it through a rhetorical lens, is that audience members must be open to consideration and in some way, shape, or form be able to implement action or whatever action that the writer or the speaker is suggesting they take. So for example, you can sit here and tell me, I could be a member of the public in this, and you could tell me to say the voting age should be let's say increase to 21. You can make that argument at me all day. But at the end of the day, I can't really do much about it. Or if you want to tell me, "Oh, at 18 you should be able to run for president." Yet again, that's a fascinating argument and I can consider its implications, but I really have no stake in this as just an everyday citizen. Or it'd be basically like telling a business professor how the biology test should be structured. Yet again, they might find your argument interesting, but they're just members of the public because they can't do anything about it. Also, what's important to remember is that they need to be open to consideration. We usually hear the saying, "It fell on deaf ears," and if you are speaking or writing to a group of individuals who just won't want to hear what you have to say, then again, it kind of goes back to what Aristotle was talking about with ethos, where if the audience isn't willing to accept you as a trustworthy or credible individual, then all of your other persuasive tactics are thrown out the window, because if they are not open to you as the speaker and if they are not open to considering your argument, then again, the opportunity for rhetoric, the opportunity for persuasion just doesn't exist. Now, it's important to remember that audience greatly influences the language, examples, and emotions found in a text. So let's go back to the Spider-Man example. So if you are, talking to your girlfriend, maybe you emphasize that she gets movie theater popcorn if she goes along with you. If you're talking to your friends, maybe, the example you use would be, hey, we can talk about the complexities of the multiverse. And if you're taking, your 7-year-old niece or nephew, you could say, hey, it's just Spider-Man. It's going to be awesome. Let's go. So you can see how the examples, the language that you use changes from one type of audience to the next. And what's fascinating is that the argument didn't change. The argument is, let's go see Spider-Man. It's the best movie for us to see right now. So that argument has not changed at all. But based off of who we are speaking to and who we want to convince, we have altered the examples that we've used, the language that we've used to frame those examples, and the emotions that we invoke to best suit the audience on who we want to convince. So the final component of the rhetorical situation that we're going to explore will be the component of constraints. Now, constraints answers the question what beliefs, accepted facts, traditions, interests, social political factors might limit or influence a writer's text. So I'll give you a great example. Remember that I live in Eastern Washington. It's a very rural part of the state. It's nothing like Seattle. I do get that a lot. We are nothing like Seattle. It's very rural. There's a lot of farmland, a number of ranches in the area. And so when we were watching political campaign ads during the previous midterm, it didn't matter what party the candidate was from, what position they were running for. Oftentimes, their campaign ads came down to, this is how we can protect farmers. This is how we can help ranchers. This is how we can help the agricultural economy that really sustains this part of the state. Now, interestingly enough, when I would watch political ads from Utah, most of them came down less to agricultural economy and more to industrial economy. So how can we get the tech industry out here? How can we help with the growing economic interest in the state of Utah? And so, even though the arguments are essentially the same, again, regardless of the candidate, regardless of where they're running, what position they're running for, their argument across the board was the same. Vote for me for this office. I am the best choice. But based off of the needs of the audience and based off of what's going on around the audience and the speaker, and what is going to ultimately convince the audience of the speaker's argument, they took very different approaches. Again, while many in Eastern Washington talked about the agricultural economy, many of those in Utah talked about more of the industrial and the tech economy. And that's just because in this case, there are different social and political factors that have influenced the ways in which the candidates decided to support their argument. Vote for me, I'm the best candidate. It also, the constraints can also examine the ways in which the audience could understand the subject. So we think about it in this way. So what this can kind of come down to are sort of the values of it all. So when we think about, in Eastern Washington with the very agricultural economy, the more rural type lifestyle that many of the voters live and have lived in for quite a while, they understand that a politician is there to help them expand and sustain their farming endeavors and their farming businesses. Whereas perhaps people in Utah see a political candidate or a representative as someone who can help the tech industry or the industrial economy that's really booming in the state. And so there are very different ways in which the audience will understand the argument based off of those constraints that are placed upon them. And it also attempts to identify the guiding framework or lenses the writer might use. So what the constraints really do is it lets you know to say, okay, this is the type of constraints, or these are the type of situations that are going on around the audience or around the speakers. So this is why the speaker or writer, this is why they made the choices they did to persuade their audience. Now, there are a couple other considerations. We won't really delve into them too much, but genre and medium are also important things to consider, especially with today's more digital environment and how much we now communicate digitally. So when we think of genre, if you write an academic paper, that's going to be appropriate for a different kind of audience than, say, a stand-up performance, right? And that's going to be different than, let's say, a rally speech for someone who's on the campaign trail. So we also want to think about genre. Once we've considered those other components of the rhetorical situation, it's all about how the speaker is applying and distributing their message that they've crafted by considering the purpose/exigence, the audience, and the constraints. This really says, okay, well, now that they have actually put together their argument that's appropriate for the audience, that addresses the constraints and clearly identifies what they're responding to, how are they going to get that message out there? Again, are they going to do it with a tweet? That's a genre. Tweeting is. Are they going to write a blog post? Are they going to compose an official government report? Like, what kind of genre are they going to use, and why is it appropriate for that particular rhetorical situation? We can also think of medium as well, so print or digital. So for example, if you are trying to convince those in your neighborhood that there needs to be a later curfew for kids during the summer, for example, let's say it's currently 9 o'clock, you think it should be 10 o'clock. Are you going to distribute that message on a brochure, or will you put together a Facebook page? You can also think about it this way. Is it going to be interactive or is it going to be static? So is it interactive like a web page where people can go and um, navigate the different content as they see appropriate, or is it more static where it doesn't change at all, and where the audience has to locate the information based on how you, the writer or the speaker, decide to structure it? So yet again, we won't really delve into these too much, but they are certainly other considerations regarding the distribution and circulation of the message based off of the speaker's reading of the rhetorical situation. Okay, so here's what we're going to do for the lecture assignment. I want you to select one artifact from the Project 1 assignment description. I'd encourage you to select one that you really would be interested in writing on for Project 1, because you never know what you do for this lecture assignment. You might be able to incorporate that text or a version of it into your paper. So you might be able to do some solid generative writing. But of course, if you do this assignment and say, hey, I'm not really a fan of this artifact, I want to move on to another, you're certainly welcome to. Now, I want you to carefully study the artifact, and I want you to describe its rhetorical situation based on the content provided in the text as well as your own knowledge. So, for example, if you decide to look at the Mitt Romney video, his campaign ad, so what in that text, what content included, and it can be both, the language that is used as well as the imagery and the music and things of that sort. You can certainly pull on many different things from several of the artifacts. So based off of what you see in the artifact, as well as your own knowledge, perhaps being residents of the state of Utah, what do you identify as the rhetorical situation? Now, to help concretize this and to actually put it into words, I want you to compose a brief write-up that answers the following question. What is the writer speaker? Why is the writer speaker writing speaking? What is their argument? So what is the argument they're making, and what are they, why are they making this argument? What is it in response to? Who do they intend to persuade? And this is where you can start to sort of incorporate your own understanding of things going on. So who do you think they want to persuade? Who do you think their audience who is open to persuasion and to action is? And what might constrain the writer or speaker's choices? So what's going on socially, politically? What are the traditions, the beliefs, the accepted facts that will ultimately influence what the speaker or writer ultimately decides to include in their final message? Now, for each of the above questions, your response should be about 30 words. Again, you don't have to write me a novel. You can certainly write more if you find it helpful, and I'm happy to provide feedback, but don't feel obligated, to throw in everything in the kitchen sink quite yet. Okay, so for your weekly homework, you'll want to include your Core Lecture 3 summary and assignment in your Week 1 submission. And all of the other material that's listed below should also be included in your weekly homework submission as one .doc file. Now, if you have any questions or if there are concepts you want to discuss in greater detail, please don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas's direct messaging system. All right, everyone, until next time.